I think the strength of this book is from a very boring historiographical choice, stressing continuity as opposed to conflict or change. And I think he does that very well. And I tried to puzzle through this about what it is that was continuous, and how this is transmitted in your narrative. And to me, and I might be wrong, but this is something to discuss, I think that continuity is formed around the shared ideal of American exceptionalism. America was exceptional not only because it was different, but better. And it was often better because it was different. And because of these differences, because it was pluralistic, or at least purported to be, America is or should be a unique force for good in the world because it has unique virtues: religious liberty, freedom of speech, other civil and political rights, democracy, that were developed in a crucible of liberty. And as such, America has a duty to spread this virtue, or at least share it with the rest of the world. And this mission to spread American virtue of liberty has led to both conflict and war, and efforts of domestic reform, isolationism, pacifism. But to me, that is the consensus. That's what is sort of shared by most policymakers, pastors, religious leaders, individuals, people in the pews, people in the Oval Office for centuries. This consensus, I think, as he shows in some of the chapters at the end, starts to break down. Starting in the 50s and accelerating in the 60s and 70s, coinciding with the decline of Protestant establishment and the emergence of Jews, Catholics, and to a certain extent neo-evangelicals, from the margins of U.S. life and thought. So I think this is the weakest part of the book, in a sense, because, maybe not the weakest, I'd say less confident part of the book, where in the 19th and 20th century, the fights were about what means should be employed to spread America's mission and unique virtue. But in the 60s, Protestant groups in particular, joined by sort of African American pastors and also Catholics, some Catholics, were asking whether America's mission was sinful or imperialistic or hegemonic. In part, I think this came from a moral critique from the periphery or the global south, and as a product, I think, as he points out, of the predominance of issues of race, development, particularly modernization theory, and détente among elite leaders. The stain of segregation, the acceptance of modernization theory, and its posit of secularization as a needed goal for the development of societies. And the eventual triumph, I believe, in Kissinger and Nixon of continental realism as the dominant academic theory in international relations, all led to this breaking up of this consensus. And that leads, I think, to sort of a less confident sort of narrative that comes towards the end of the book. Doesn't mean there isn't continuity. It just means that it is diffuse, and it gets diffused into Jews and Catholics and neo-evangelicals. And my quibble here is that the book doesn't do a good job of, or not a convincing job, of delineating for me why Jews would join the consensus of American exceptionalism, even though you say they brought human rights into the sort of center of sort of American foreign policy, and there was a moral critique stemming from the Holocaust, but it's a bland and one-dimensional sort of a couple pages that you devote to it. Similarly, there isn't a convincing argument in my mind of how the new right, or at least this consensus that develops in the 70s and into the 80s that became part of the Reagan coalition and forward, how Protestants in general gave up their sort of distrust of both Jews and Catholics, and moved towards sort of cooperation, intimate cooperation on many issues, over the period. I do think that, that some Protestant evangelicals and some fundamentalist Protestants and segments of a diverse coalition of what we now call the New Right, including some Jews, Catholics, and Mormons, emerged to keep alive the ideal of America's global mission. I think the cultural power, the moral vocabulary of this ideal is not as strong, is not as widely shared as it was during the centuries of the Protestant establishment, and therefore doesn't make it all the way to elite circles in the way that it did in World War II, World War I, and in the immediate Cold War. And I don't think that's a bad thing, frankly, personally. And I think that the fragmenting sort of meta-narrative of American exceptionalism, I think, has led to a flourishing of ecumenical interest-based coalitions to advance individual civil and political rights, which has focused political efforts to pass legislation like IRFA or the Trafficking in Persons Act against elite opinion, which has placed countries like Sudan on the list of U.S. priorities. I mean, does anyone here think that there would be a country of South Sudan right now without the coalition of evangelicals and Catholics and Hollywood types who have, made Sudan sort of a priority in some respects, to engage faith-based actors in addressing issues of poverty and development, and also I think as sort of an outgrowth of the breakup of the consensus. Eventually, I think there is common people in this room who I admire, like Tom and Will and others, who have become part of what is a flourishing, empirically based sort of effort to provide evidence that demonstrates that religious liberty is crucial to the thriving of societies and to peace. And in sort of the sort of World Bank social capital reports and the Tony Blair project at Yale, to look at how religious actors and communities are critical to the success of global health and economic development. I think that this is an outgrowth maybe of, and I haven't really thought this through yet, but a turning on its head of modernization theory in some respect. And particularly the secularization of modernization theory, particularly in the areas of economic development and health. So in conclusion, the influence of religious actors may be more diffuse than in the past. The activities of religious coalitions may be more episodic, interest-based, and even partisan. And I think there will remain serious doubters about the worth of American exceptionalism. But I think, and maybe this is the idealistic side of me coming again from my cadet days, I think we're approaching a time when I think it will be recognized widely in foreign policy circles that humans are spiritual creatures who thrive best when they enjoy freedom to express their fundamental dignity, and that religion itself and the promotion of religious freedom as a foreign policy interest will be viewed by strategists and opinion makers not only as a secret ingredient or as a missing element in the pursuit of American war or the support of American war or peace, but as an interest fundamentally tied to the success of other global interests in prosperity, education, stability, and security.